Have you ever stood in a room full of people and quietly felt like none of them could touch you? Not because you were proud, but because something in you didn't trust being close anymore. It wasn't superiority, it was survival. Somewhere along the way, your heart learned it was safer to stand apart than to be let down again. You didn't want to be the outsider, but you also couldn't risk being disappointed. So you crafted a version of yourself that didn't need anyone, or at least looked like it didn't. It's strange, isn't it, how we can carry so much pain and disguise it as strength. We become distant, but call it independence. We become hypercritical, but call it discernment. We become unavailable, but call it boundaries. We stop expecting warmth from others and start performing the role of someone who never wanted it in the first place. But if you slow down, just for a moment, you might hear the softer voice underneath all of it. The one whispering, "I used to want so much more." This isn't arrogance, it's armor. You're not above them, you're just hurt. And somewhere in your life, closeness got paired with pain. So now you equate detachment with safety. But safety isn't the same as peace. And self-protection isn't the same as self-worth. You didn't become distant because you stopped caring. You became distant because you cared too much, for too long, and didn't know what to do with all the disappointment. You were the one who kept showing up. The one who remembered birthdays, sent check-in messages, gave second chances, forgave even when it still stung. And at some point, you looked around and wondered, why am I the only one trying? So you stopped trying. Not loudly, quietly, elegantly. You stepped back. You let the calls go unanswered. You stayed on the surface of things, smiling when appropriate, nodding when expected, but the warmth was gone. You didn't want to get burned again. And yet, you never stopped hoping. Because even the most defended hearts still long to be seen. We don't become cold out of nowhere. We become cold from being warm too many times and having no one notice the fire dying inside us. Carl Jung once said, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life." And maybe this, aloof, version of you is one of those disguises. One you wear not out of vanity, but out of memory. Memory of being let down, of being overlooked, of watching people misinterpret your loyalty as weakness, your kindness as naivety, your emotional honesty as too much. So now, you wear silence like it's grace. But grace isn't supposed to feel this lonely, is it? There's a moment in everyone's story where they confuse being untouchable with being healed. But real healing doesn't mean you stop needing people. It just means you stop needing people who hurt you. And in that gap, between longing and fear, many of us build a throne made of distance, mistaking it for power. But emotional isolation isn't power. It's just protection, repeated for so long. We forgot it was temporary. Somewhere in your life, being misunderstood became a pattern, not because you were dramatic or difficult, but because you felt deeply in a world that rewards detachment. And when your depth wasn't met, your instinct wasn't to try harder, it was to climb higher. Above the noise, above the chaos, above the risk of intimacy. So you built your own world, your own logic, your own reasons why people just don't get it. And maybe they don't, but that doesn't mean you're better than them. It just means you're hurt in a way they can't see. Because the child in you, the one who once loved so freely, was never truly seen for who they were. And that child learned, if I'm not celebrated, I'll be untouchable. If I'm not wanted, I'll be invincible. If I'm not loved right, I'll stop needing love altogether. But that child never stopped wanting. They just got quieter about it. That's what unprocessed hurt does. It changes our posture, not our need. We stand taller, but we ache just the same. And maybe you've become so good at hiding your ache, even you forgot it was there. But here's the quiet truth. You don't need to keep pretending. You don't need to keep being the one who's above it all. Because you're not. You're here, with the rest of us, trying to figure it out, wrestling with what it means to care and protect yourself at the same time. And that's okay. It's okay that you feel safer at a distance. It's okay that some people exhausted you. It's okay that you chose silence instead of another one-sided connection. But just don't confuse your hurt with your identity. You are not the persona you created to survive. You are not the distance you used to breathe. You are not the mask that made the room tolerable. You're the one behind all of that, the one who still wants to feel understood without performing. And that version of you? They're not unreachable. They're just waiting. Waiting for the moment when you no longer need to keep score, no longer need to win every emotional battle, no longer need to prove that you're above all this. Because healing doesn't come when we win. Healing comes when we unclench. When we stop trying to outrun the wound and turn around to hold it. When we realize that the love we stopped asking for, we still deserve. That even the strongest parts of us are exhausted from pretending. That the real kind of strength isn't being above people, it's allowing ourselves to need them again. Carefully, slowly, without shame. Viktor Frankl once wrote, "An abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior." You didn't become cold for no reason. You learned to be distant because closeness was once a threat. You learned to intellectualize because feeling too much felt like drowning. You learned to perform strength because vulnerability wasn't safe in the room you were raised in. And I know, maybe the people around you don't get that. Maybe they think you're arrogant, detached, emotionless. But that's only because they never saw the full story. They never saw the early chapters, the ones filled with quiet betrayals. Emotional abandonment, subtle rejections that made you question your worth without anyone ever saying the words out loud. But you remember what it felt like to need and be met with nothing. You remember the disappointment that kept adding up until it calcified into strategy. Not a conscious one, but one that lived in your bones. Don't expect too much. Don't get too close. Don't need what no one's offering. But maybe, just maybe, it's time to question that strategy. Not to shame it, but to outgrow it. Because you're not the same person who once had to survive by detachment. You're not trapped in the same room anymore. And even if part of you still braces for abandonment, you're allowed to test the waters again. Not recklessly, but gently. Because your healing doesn't mean rushing into connection. It just means not pushing it away before it even starts. Let the armor loosen. Let the sharp edges soften. You don't have to prove anything by being untouchable. You're allowed to be reachable and still safe. You're allowed to feel deeply and still be grounded. You're allowed to need and still be whole. And if no one told you this before, let me say it now. You don't need to be above anyone to be okay. You just need to be with yourself, fully, kindly, honestly, even the parts of you that still ache when no one's looking. Especially those. Because they're not weakness. They're your humanity. And the more you honor that, the less you'll need to perform strength for a world that never really saw you anyway. Let the throne go. Let the distance dissolve. You don't need to be above the crowd to feel safe. You just need to come back to yourself. Quietly, softly, fully. You're not unreachable. You're just healing. And you're allowed to take your time. If this resonated, you're not alone. Let me know what part felt real to you. Sometimes, the hardest thing to admit is that we still care. Not because caring is wrong, but because it makes us feel exposed. And when you've been let down enough times, exposure doesn't feel like honesty, it feels like danger. So instead, you retreat into the safety of distance. You convince yourself that detachment is clarity. That being unbothered is maturity. That being alone is power. But power without connection becomes isolation. And maturity without vulnerability becomes numbness. You're not above it, you're in it, whether you acknowledge it or not. Because when you lay down at night, in the quiet that no one else hears, the thoughts that come aren't lofty. They're longing. You think about the messages you didn't send, the conversations you avoided, the people you pushed away before they had the chance to drift. You call it wisdom, but some of it was just fear. Fear of repeating a pain you never learned how to name. Fear of being seen before you're ready to be touched. Fear of hope, because hope felt like the beginning of another letdown. And so, you wear the cloak of superiority, not because you think you're better, but because you've forgotten what it's like to feel safe as an equal. To sit beside someone and not brace for disappointment. To be met, not managed. To be held, not analyzed. That's what the younger version of you needed. Not lectures, not judgment, not silence. Just someone who could say, "I see you, and I'm not leaving." But instead, maybe you got distance, or shame, or advice wrapped in coldness. And over time, you learned that needing others only led to pain. So now, you call it self-sufficiency. But what if the part of you that withdrew isn't your truest self? What if it's just the self you became when you had no other choice? Alfred Adler believed that all behavior is goal-directed, that even our detachment is trying to achieve something. To preserve dignity, to avoid humiliation, to maintain control. But control isn't the same as peace. And dignity isn't meant to cost you connection. You're not bad for withdrawing. You're not broken for feeling better alone sometimes. But don't let your wound rewrite the meaning of love. Love is still possible, even if you've outgrown the people who used to define it for you. Even if you've learned to move through the world with caution. Even if you don't know how to ask for what you need anymore. You don't have to start with trust. You can start with honesty. A quiet kind. The kind that says, I'm still figuring it out, but I know I'm tired of pretending not to care. Because that pretending, it weighs more than the pain ever did. It keeps you in rooms you've outgrown. It keeps you performing roles that suffocate your truth. It keeps you chasing respect instead of intimacy. But the real you, the honest, imperfect, still healing you, doesn't need to be above the world to be free. You just need to step off the pedestal. Not to fall, but to land. Back into your body. Back into your feelings. Back into the humanity you've worked so hard to hide behind intellect, sarcasm, and distance. Let people think what they want. Let them misread your silence. But you come home to yourself. Gently, kindly, slowly. You don't have to prove you're unshakable anymore. You're allowed to tremble. You're allowed to break open. Not because you're weak, but because you're ready to stop holding everything in. Because when you finally stop pretending you don't care, you'll find a softer kind of strength waiting underneath. One that doesn't need a wall between you and the world. One that says, I still want to be known, even if I'm scared. And that is not weakness. That is courage in its purest form. That is what healing sounds like when you're quiet enough to hear it. That's what love feels like, real love, the kind that doesn't ask you to be untouchable, but welcomes your ache and your edge and your softness in the same breath. You were never meant to carry this alone. So put down the weight of needing to look okay. Put down the weight of needing to always be in control. Put down the idea that you're too much or too different to ever feel safe in connection. You are not above everyone. You're just healing from the times you were below, unnoticed, unheard, unloved. And healing takes time. But it doesn't require perfection. Only presence. Only the willingness to show up, even if your hands are still shaking. Even if your voice is still learning how to speak without defense. Even if your heart is still practicing how to stay open, just a little longer than last time. This is not about proving you don't need anyone. This is about remembering you were never meant to be untouched. Because love, the kind that truly sees you, will never require you to be untouchable. It will meet you in the ache and say, you don't have to be above the world to be worthy of it. That is the kind of love you deserve. That is the kind of life that begins the moment you stop hiding behind the pain. You're not broken. You're not arrogant. You're not too complicated to be understood. You're just tired. And that's okay. Because even tired hearts still deserve a soft place to land. Let this be yours. If this resonated, you're not alone. Let me know what part felt real to you.